Here is a shimmering purple ink by Ancient Charm, The Moon Over the Mountain Pass.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This shimmer can, at times, overpower the color of the ink, covering up a very nice purple tone. I never experienced any kind of flow issues or any clogging, but I did notice the shimmer doesn't seem to make its way through the Lamy All-Star feed very well. It's not clogging it, it's just not getting through. Just not putting shimmer down from that pen, and I checked, and it is in the converter. So it gives a good look at the ink all by itself. There's the positive that comes from it. This is a noticeable amount of shimmer difference by pen, but it never fails to perform, except, of course, looking at the shimmer from that broad nib. I can say I have come to appreciate and enjoy the shimmer inks, and this is a fun one, really, for general daily use. No special occasion needed here.
The pen for today is
an Esterbrook Etsy.
All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, you get to see that purple as it goes down, and really as it dries, the shimmer sets into place, which then, depending on the angle, could make it harder to read, but generally not too bad, really. Now, there's no feather, there's no spread, there is shading that I'm seeing going on. You see it in never and having on the first line, you see it in speak and to. Anywhere it starts getting darker, you really see the shimmer come out, making what would be darker appear lighter at times, depending on the light that's in front of you. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, which means we get more of that shimmer. No feather, no spread. There is shading. You see it in the word moment on the first line. You see it in wood of the second line, curious on the first line, even whispered on the third line. But mostly what you really get here is a pretty consistent amount of shimmer going down on the page, making most of that shading kind of disappear. Looking at the medium nib, it is right about the same tone as it was with the wet fine. No feather, no spread. The shimmer is absolutely not dominating. It is a really good complement to what's going on here. As the shading goes on, if you look at lit or lost on the second line, it's darker to lighter to darker, and the shimmer comes and goes with it. Same with no on the third line, starting darker, working its way lighter. Same thing happens with the shimmer with more to less. And where, right next to that, goes less shimmer to more or lighter to darker. Looking at the broad nib, the most noticeable thing is you barely see any shimmer at all happen. Now, there, as a color, it's lighter than it was with the medium. There's no feather, there's no spread, there is some shading going on. Look at the Y in only on the first line, or look at the word get on the first line, where it starts lighter, becomes darker. Way away on the first line compared to his directly underneath it, his is much darker and really nice to look at. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 5 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and no spread. We do get shading coming through. You see it very well enough where it did on the first line, starting lighter and getting darker at the second D. Or the letter A on the second line, that is light on the left and dark on the right. And a very interesting thing is the shimmer is coming through on this paper, which very rarely happens on non-fountain pen friendly paper. It's the papers that have been chosen here tend to perform well with fountain pens, and the shimmer is strong with this one. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get nothing for shading, but a very consistent covering of the shimmer particles. So depending on the angle you get this very nice, beautiful purple, or you get this very gold writing. So this could be a toss-up in your preference because of the performance and how it's looking. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we don't get any shading, but we do get shimmering that's coming and going. It's very interesting because it's all one tone, but I'm looking at it at an angle now where all I can see is the ink, and then when I move, I see the shimmer come in where it would have been shading areas. So this really does add a very interesting kind of character into the writing. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium nib, the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get a little bit of shading. You see it in anxious on the first line, or up here on the second line, and at any on the third line, so it certainly shades very nicely. Looking at the back of the page, you see the ink got quite deep into the paper, especially on the medium nib. I don't think you could write on the back of the page with that one. Otherwise, the ghosting's not too bad, but nothing bled through, touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it's about as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, the tone that we're getting is a bit more magenta leaning, and it's still a very nice color. The color change is a result of the paper, not a problem, but it's not so much a purple as a magenta now. No feather, no spread. Really, the shading is showing up. The shimmer is showing up. I'm very impressed by how the shimmer is holding up to the non-fountain pen friendly papers, and it's doing it so well and so really consistently, not something you normally see. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine in terms of its tone, but again, it's more of a magenta lean than a purple at this point. No feather, no spread, no shade. The shimmer shows up within the writing and it doesn't show up nearly as much as it did on the last paper. Really very little, and for the most part, what we're just getting is the color, but you do see the shimmer show up in the first line, good to eat, and you see it on riddles in the third line, and a couple of spots here and there. Just seems like it was more or less devoured by this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is just little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. A little bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine. Again, slightly more magenta as a lean here. Still a very nice purple in what's going on, even though I'm saying it's kind of a magenta lean. No feather, no spread, no shading, no shimmer to be seen here. Made me wonder if perhaps the shimmer itself had run out on that converter. I looked inside and it was still there, so it's just not showing through on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little lighter than it was with the medium. Tiny bit darker, I think, than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, no shading. Not very interesting considering this has been an otherwise interesting ink. I think really we're losing something in this case without having the shimmer. So normally I look at shimmer inks and I wonder how they would look without it. I'm getting it here, and on this paper, it's uninteresting. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it got quite deep into the paper. A lot of ghosting going on. I don't think you could write back here, but none of this bled through touching the page underneath. And I really kind of expected it to come through with the medium, seeing how deep it is into the paper.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left. Pen flush is on the top right. 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shimmering very well, we do get shading very well. It really is holding up well. I think this is a good middle paper to hit, like a resetting the palette onto something much more standard, and I'm really happy with where this shows up in that rotation. So I'm going to probably stay with this for a long time, this particular paper rotation. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with little bits of shading. They're really not coming through as well here as they did on the Clairfontaine, but the shimmer is coming through a very strong, really being there, showing it's holding in the pen. I do try to keep the pens rotating in my hand to keep that shimmer alive inside the converter. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading just as well as the Clairfontaine, and we do get shimmer, confirming the fact that there was shimmer still in the converter and it just wasn't coming out on that last paper. It's very nice going on here. Still, the darker areas contain more shimmer so that in certain light it seems much lighter and almost to the point of disappearing. That would depend on the color of the paper you used then. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, the same tone as on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. The shimmer is still not coming through that pen, but we do get some light peppering of shading. A few darker spots show themselves, like the end of nobody on the first line, or the P's and up on the second line. Anytime you're dotting or putting commas, little bits like that seem to show up just a bit darker than the rest of the writing. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Lavender. Here is Diamine Lilac Satin. Here is Noodler's Purple Mountain Majesties. Here is Sailor's Sweet Potato Purple. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with some shading going on, without the shimmer that has been there otherwise. This paper is really just absorbing it into it, making it have no effect on your writing, though I don't think it's generally a good idea to use shimmer inks on your notes, because your teacher won't appreciate it and might knock you down a whole letter grade just out of principle. But this one still looks nice on this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do still see some shading coming through, and more in the terms of we get some darker spots throughout the letters. Take a look at the second line. It wants a. It is quite a bit darker. Wants starts light, gets dark at the T, lightens up at the S, and then the A at the end, darker except the end of the H. Not bad. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little lighter than we had with the wet fine. Little bit, just a little bit, I think, darker, just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, no shimmer, but shading. The shading, I think, is standing out better than it did with the wet fine. Take a look at horses on the third line, or think on the first line, him on the second. You see him right there. It draws your attention to it. So it shades pretty decent on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, still no shimmer making its way through that lamy. Tiny bits of shading, couple tiny spots, really dotting it. Take a look at they on the first line. You can see it goes from a nice mid-tone on the T, dark at the H, lightens up at the Y, stands starting lighter and working its way darker. I think it's doing a very nice job here, and an unexpectedly better job than I was looking for. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting is no problem and nothing bleeds through touching the page underneath.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a green ink by Diatramentis Heliogen Green Brun. Here is a gray ink by Papier Plume Oyster Gray. Here is a pink ink by Sailor Kobe No. 30. Here is a yellow ink by Califolio Ochre Juan. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. I don't like how this looks. I don't see this as a manageable thing in what's going on, in that the spread and the feather just are kind of gross. But if you had to, I guess you could. I will say that it does shade. You see it in the first line on new, and you see it in well on the second line, and chestnuts on the third. The shading here is just not saving the look of this ink on this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. Yes, it looks kind of gross. No, there's no shimmer. No, there's no shade. But you do have something that looks gross on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the wet fine. Still darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Still feathering, still spreading, still no shimmer, still no shade, still gross on the page. You will still hold on to this paper at the end because people always want it. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. Just a tad bit, only a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now we get feathering, we get spread, though I think the feathering and the spread is less than what we had on the wet fine, but I still wouldn't go for it. Now, I think it's much more manageable here than it was there, but I still wouldn't go for it. We don't get any kind of shading, which is a good thing with copy paper. And this little bit lighter, I think, looks better on the paper. So I guess if you wanted to, you could. Looking at the page underneath, you see it bled through with the broad, with the medium, with the wet fine, with the soft fine. It's ghosting is out of control. There's no using the back of the page. Not that I had high expectations for copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
I really enjoyed it most from a medium to wet flow fine. I know you would expect a gusher of a broad, but surprise, I think the darker tone and the amount of shimmer that we were getting were really spot on. I liked that darker ink tone and the amount of shimmer that was coming out. It has a kind of royal feeling to it. So for that, I stay with the wet fine and say, let this be a daily use ink. Don't hold it for some special occasion. That's just kind of odd to me.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you're not subscribed, I would invite you to do so now.